The jungle erupted in a symphony of death as Marine Private First Class Robert Leckie pressed his face into the mud of Henderson Field, mortar shells screaming overhead like banshees from hell. It was the 7th of August, 1942, and the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific had begun with the fury of 1,000 storms. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with the sweet stench of tropical decay as American forces stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal, an obscure island in the Solomon Chain that would become the graveyard of Japanese naval supremacy. Major General Alexander Archer Vandegrift watched through his binoculars as the first wave of Marines hit Red Beach, their landing craft grinding against the volcanic sand under a sky painted crimson by the rising sun. The intelligence reports had been wrong. There was no massive Japanese resistance waiting for them. Instead, the enemy had melted into the jungle like ghosts, leaving behind half-finished airfields and abandoned construction equipment. But Vandegrift knew better than to trust this apparent gift from Providence. The Japanese would return, and when they did, they would bring the full weight of their combined fleet. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson adjusted his helmet as his 1st Raider Battalion pushed inland through the dense vegetation. The silence was more terrifying than gunfire. Every rustling leaf could conceal a sniper. Every shadow might hide a machine gun nest. His men moved with the practiced efficiency of elite troops, but he could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes darted between the towering trees that formed a green cathedral of potential death. According to historical records from the Marine Corps' archives, Edson's Raiders were among the most highly trained units in the Pacific, having undergone specialized jungle warfare training in preparation for exactly this type of operation. Japanese had been constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal for months, and its completion would give them a strategic advantage that could shift the entire balance of power in the Pacific. From this base, Japanese bombers could strike at Allied shipping lanes and support bases throughout the region, effectively cutting off Australia and New Zealand from American reinforcement. The stakes could not have been higher. This was more than just another island to capture. It was the key to the entire Pacific War. As the Marines consolidated their beachhead, Navy Captain Richmond Kelly Turner's Task Force 62 maintained station offshore, their guns trained on the jungle-covered ridges that commanded the landing zones. The heavy cruisers USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and USS Quincy stood ready to provide fire support, their 8-inch guns loaded with high-explosive shells. But Turner knew that his ships were vulnerable to air attack, and Japanese bases at Rabaul were less than 600 miles away, well within range of enemy bombers. The first day had gone better than anyone had dared hope. By nightfall, over 10,000 Marines were ashore, and the unfinished Japanese airfield was in American hands. Vandegrift established his command post in a captured Japanese bunker, studying maps by the light of a kerosene lantern while the sounds of the jungle pressed in around them. His operations officer, Colonel Gerald Thomas, pointed to the ridges surrounding the airfield high ground that dominated the entire area and would have to be held at all costs. "The Japanese will be back," Vandegrift said quietly, his weathered face grim in the lamplight. "And when they come, they'll come with everything they have. We need to get this airfield operational before they can organize a counterattack." The captured Japanese documents revealed the true scope of their construction project, not just an airfield, but a major naval base that would have served as the jumping-off point for the invasion of Australia itself. 3 days after the initial landing, the first Japanese counterattack materialized from the morning mist like a fever dream. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 21st Infantry Regiment had force-marched through the jungle for 2 days, their uniforms rotting in the humidity, their rice rations crawling with insects. Ichiki was a veteran of the China campaigns, a man who believed that Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. He was about to learn the terrible cost of underestimating American firepower. The attack came at dawn on the 21st of August, as Marine Private First Class John Basalna was cleaning his machine gun in the pre-dawn darkness. The Japanese emerged from the jungle in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming in the pale light, their voices raised in the traditional banzai cry that had terrified enemies across Asia. But the Marines of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, were not Chinese peasants or British colonials caught off guard. They were professional soldiers armed with modern weapons and backed by the industrial might of America. Basalone's machine gun opened fire first, its chattering roar cutting through the morning air like a buzz saw through timber. The Japanese soldiers fell in neat rows, their bodies piling up in the wire obstacles that the Marines had strung across the Tenarú River. But still they came, wave after wave of screaming men who seemed to welcome death as a release from the Kitsuzima dishonor of retreat. Colonel Ichiki himself fell in the final assault, his sword raised high as bullets tore through his chest. Meanwhile, in the waters off Savo Island, a different kind of battle was reaching its climax. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had brought 7 cruisers and a destroyer down from Rabaul, slipping past Allied reconnaissance in the darkness. His target was the American transport fleet, still unloading supplies and equipment on the beaches of Guadalcanal. If he could destroy the transports, the Marines would be stranded without reinforcement or resupply. The Battle of Savo Island began at 1:57 in the morning on the 9th of August, when Japanese searchlights suddenly illuminated the Allied cruiser USS Canberra. The Australian ship was torn apart by a concentrated barrage of 8-inch shells and torpedoes, her hull split open like a gutted fish. The USS Chicago tried to respond, but was hit by a torpedo that flooded her bow compartments. In less than an hour, the Japanese had sunk 4 Allied cruisers and damaged several others, in what would become known as the worst defeat in United States Navy history. Captain Howard Bode of the USS Chicago watched in horror as his sister ships burned around him, their magazines exploding in fountains of flame that lit up the night sky. According to naval historical records maintained by the Naval War College, the surprise attack at Savo Island demonstrated the superior night fighting capabilities of the Japanese Navy, whose crews had trained extensively in low-light conditions, and whose ships were equipped with advanced optics and superior torpedo technology. But Mikawa made a crucial error. Instead of pressing his attack against the vulnerable transports, he withdrew his fleet to avoid daylight air attacks from American carriers. The decision would haunt him for the rest of the war, as those same transports continued to pour men and supplies onto Guadalcanal's beaches. The Marines were stranded, but they were not defenseless, and every day they held the island brought them closer to making Henderson Field operational. As the sun rose over the carnage at Savo Island, the water was black with oil and littered with debris from the sunken ships. Hundreds of Allied sailors clung to life rafts and floating wreckage, many of them wounded, all of them witnesses to the brutal reality of naval warfare in the age of steel and fire. The Japanese had won a tactical victory, but the strategic situation remained unchanged. The Marines were still on Guadalcanal, and Henderson Field was still in American hands. The sound of hammering echoed across Henderson Field as Navy Seabees worked around the clock to complete the captured Japanese airstrip. Lieutenant Colonel Harold William Bauer supervised the construction, his sleeves rolled up, sweat streaming down his face in the oppressive heat. The runway was a ribbon of crushed coral and volcanic rock, barely long enough for the Marine Corps' Grumman Wildcat fighters, but it represented something far more precious than its crude appearance suggested. It was hope made manifest in steel and concrete. The first American aircraft landed on Henderson Field on the 20th of August, 1942. Major John Lewson Smith brought his VMF 223 Marine Fighter Squadron down through the afternoon heat haze, their Wildcats kicking up clouds of coral dust as they touched down on the primitive runway. The Marines on the ground cheered as the fighters taxied to a halt, their engines ticking in the sudden silence. For the first time since the landing, American air power was based on Guadalcanal itself. Captain Marion Eugene Carl climbed down from his cockpit and surveyed the scene around him. The airfield was a maze of bomb craters and construction equipment, surrounded by dense jungle that could hide 1,000 enemies. Fuel was stored in 55-gallon drums scattered around the perimeter, and the maintenance facilities consisted of tents and improvised shelters. But it was operational, and that was all that mattered. The Japanese monopoly on air power in the Solomons had been broken. The first test came 3 days later when a formation of Japanese Betty bombers appeared over Henderson Field, their twin engines droning like angry wasps. Smith led 8 Wildcats up to intercept them, climbing through the humid air as anti-aircraft guns opened fire from the ground. The Marine pilots had been training for this moment for months, studying Japanese tactics and aircraft performance, learning to exploit the weaknesses of enemy designs. The air battle was brief but decisive. The Wildcats tore through the Japanese formation like sharks through a school of fish, their .650 caliber machine guns blazing. 3 Betty bombers went down in flames, their crews dying in the cockpits as their aircraft disintegrated around them. The remaining Japanese planes jettisoned their bombs harmlessly into the jungle and fled back toward Rabaul, their mission a complete failure. Down in the jungle, Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was organizing a much more serious threat. His 35th Infantry Brigade had been landed at Taivu Point under cover of darkness, and he was now moving his 2,500 men through the dense vegetation toward Henderson Field. Unlike Colonel Ichiki, Kawaguchi was a careful planner who understood the importance of reconnaissance and preparation. He had studied the American positions for days, looking for weaknesses in their perimeter. The terrain around Henderson Field was a maze of ridges and ravines covered in triple canopy jungle. According to intelligence reports preserved in the Hueco National Archives, the area was considered nearly impassable by conventional military standards, with steep slopes covered in thorny vines and streams that could rise 6 feet in an hour during the frequent tropical storms. But Kawaguchi believed that this same terrain would provide concealment for his attacking forces and prevent the Americans from bringing their superior firepower to bear. Colonel Merritt Edson had been given responsibility for defending the southern approaches to Henderson Field, the most likely avenue of Japanese attack. His 1st Raider Battalion had been reinforced with elements of the 1st Parachute Battalion, giving him about 800 men to hold a front that stretched for over a mile. The position was anchored on a low ridge that the Marines had dubbed Bloody Ridge, though they did not yet know how prophetic that name would prove to be. The ridge was barely 100 feet high, but it commanded the entire southern approach to the airfield. Edson had his men dig in along the military crest, where they could bring fire to bear on the slopes below while remaining protected from enemy observation. The foxholes were deep and well camouflaged, connected by communication trenches that allowed movement between positions without exposure to enemy fire. It was a textbook defensive position, but textbooks had never faced the fanatical determination of Japanese infantry. The jungle came alive with the sound of movement on the night of the 13th of September, as if the earth itself was stirring with malevolent purpose. Colonel Merritt Edson crouched in his command post, listening to the reports crackling over his field radio. Japanese forces were massing in the ravines below Bloody Ridge, their movements betrayed by the snap of breaking branches and the metallic clink of equipment. The attack would come before dawn. Edson was certain of it. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had divided his force into 3 columns, each approaching Henderson Field from a different direction. His plan was to overwhelm the American defenders with simultaneous attacks, preventing them from shifting reserves to meet each threat. The main assault would come up the southern ridges, while diversionary attacks struck the eastern and western perimeters. It was a sound tactical concept, but it required precise timing and coordination in terrain that made communication nearly impossible. The first Japanese shells began falling on Henderson Field at 9:30 in the evening, fired by howitzers that had been manhandled through the jungle piece by piece. The explosions walked across the airfield in a pattern of destruction, cratering the runway and setting fuel dumps ablaze. Marine pilots ran for their aircraft, trying to save what they could from the bombardment. Several Wildcats were destroyed. Where they sat, their aluminum frames melting in the intense heat of burning aviation gasoline. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Burwell Puller arrived at Bloody Ridge just as the artillery barrage lifted. His 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had been rushed forward to reinforce Edson's thinly stretched line. Puller was a legend in the Marine Corps, a man who had earned his spurs fighting bandits in Nicaragua, and whose very presence could steady the nerves of green troops facing their first battle. His men called him Chesty for his habit of thrusting out his chest when he walked, and they would follow him into hell itself. The Japanese attack began with a sound that froze the blood, the high-pitched scream of "Banzai" echoing through the darkness. Hundreds of enemy soldiers emerged from the jungle like demons from the underworld, their bayonets glinting in the light of burning aircraft. They came in waves, each one stepping over the bodies of the men who had fallen before them, their faces twisted with the fanaticism of the samurai code. Edson's raiders met them with disciplined fire, their rifles and machine guns cutting down the attackers in neat rows. But the Japanese kept coming, their officers leading from the front with drawn swords, their voices raised in the ancient battle cry that had echoed across Asian battlefields for centuries. The Marine line began to bend under the pressure, individual foxholes being overrun by sheer weight of numbers. Private First Class Mitchell Page found himself alone at his machine gun position, his entire squad killed or wounded around him. The barrel of his weapon was glowing red-hot from continuous firing, and his ammunition was running low. But he kept the gun chattering, traversing back and forth across the slope below him, cutting down Japanese soldiers who seemed to materialize from the darkness like ghosts. According to Medal of Honor citations preserved in military records, Page would hold his position for the entire night, repelling attack after attack by a force that outnumbered him 50-1. The battle raged until dawn, with the Japanese launching assault after assault against the Marine positions. Each attack brought them closer to breaking through, and several times enemy soldiers actually reached the runway before being driven back by desperate counterattacks. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood, and the ground was carpeted with bodies from both sides. But when the sun finally rose over Henderson Field, the American flag was still flying, and the runway was still in Marine hands. General Kawaguchi had lost over half his force in the night attack, including most of his experienced officers and non-commissioned officers. The survivors melted back into the jungle, carrying their wounded with them and leaving behind hundreds of dead. The Japanese had discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of the war. American troops could fight just as fiercely as any samurai when their backs were against the wall. And they had the firepower to make that courage count. Morning sun revealed the true cost of the night's battle as Marine Corporal Robert Leckie walked among the bodies scattered across Bloody Ridge. Japanese soldiers lay twisted in the positions where they had fallen, their uniforms torn by shrapnel, their weapons still clutched in death-stiffened hands. The smell of death was already beginning to rise in the tropical heat, mixing with the acrid smoke from the burning fuel dumps to create an atmosphere that seemed to embody the very essence of war itself. Henderson Field looked like a moonscape, pockmarked with shell craters and littered with the twisted wreckage of aircraft. But the Seabees were already at work, filling the holes in the runway with crushed coral and salvaging what they could from the damaged planes. Within hours, the first Wildcats were taking off again, their engines roaring defiance at the Japanese forces still lurking in the jungle. The airfield had survived its first major test, but everyone knew that worse was coming. Major John Smith gathered his remaining pilots in the shade of a damaged hangar tent, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and their flight suits stained with sweat and cordite. The Marine Fighter Squadron 223 had been reduced to less than half strength, with several of their best pilots killed or wounded in the previous week's fighting. But reinforcements were coming. Navy and Army Air Force squadrons were being rushed to Guadalcanal from bases throughout the Quotale Pacific. The mixed collection of American aircraft operating from Henderson Field became known as the Cactus Air Force, taking their name from the radio call sign for Guadalcanal. They flew whatever planes they could get: Marine Wildcats, Navy Dauntless dive bombers, Army Air Force P-400s, and even a few captured Japanese aircraft that had been repaired and pressed into service. It was an unlikely collection of machines and men, but they shared a common purpose: to deny the Japanese control of the skies over the SOLOMON. Sadak Captain Joe Foss arrived with his Marine Fighter Squadron 121 in early October, bringing with him a new tactics manual and a reputation as one of the most aggressive pilots in the Pacific. According to historical records from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, Foss had developed innovative fighter tactics during training in California, emphasizing teamwork and mutual support over the individual heroics that had characterized early Pacific air combat. His methods would prove devastatingly effective against Japanese formations that relied on the superior maneuverability of their Zero fighters. The Japanese response was swift and overwhelming. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, had decided that Guadalcanal must be recaptured at any cost. He assembled the largest Japanese naval force of the war, including 4 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The armada was so massive that it darkened the horizon when it appeared off the Solomon Islands, its presence detected by Allied reconnaissance aircraft while it was still hundreds of miles away. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands began on the Fade and on the 26th of October, 1942, when aircraft from the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet clashed with Japanese carrier planes in the skies northeast of Guadalcanal. The fighting was savage and decisive, with both sides throwing everything they had into the aerial melee. The Hornet was sunk, her flight deck torn apart by Japanese dive bombers, but the Enterprise survived to continue the fight. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley led his Fighting Squadron 10 against a formation of Japanese Val dive bombers, his section of Wildcats climbing through the morning air to intercept the enemy before they could reach the American carriers. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of aerial combat, with the American pilots using superior tactics and gunnery to overcome the numerical advantage of their opponents. Flatley himself shot down 3 Japanese aircraft before his ammunition ran out, then used his propeller as a weapon to slice through the wing of a 4th enemy plane. But it was the pilots of the Cactus Air Force who made the decisive contribution to the battle. Flying from Henderson Field, they struck at the Japanese fleet as it maneuvered for position, their bombs and torpedoes finding targets among the massed enemy ships. The Japanese carriers were forced to divide their attention between the American fleet and the land-based aircraft, a tactical disadvantage that proved fatal to their offensive plans. By the end of the day, both sides had lost heavily, but the Japanese had failed to achieve their objective of destroying American naval power in the Solomons. The waters around Guadalcanal had earned a new name by November of 1942: Iron Bottom Sound, in honor of the dozens of warships that lay on the ocean floor like a vast underwater graveyard. Every night brought new naval battles as Japanese and American forces clashed in the narrow waters between the islands, their guns flashing in the darkness like deadly lightning. The sound of naval gunfire had become as familiar to the Marines on Henderson Field as the cry of tropical birds or the whisper of wind through the jungle canopy. Rear Admiral Daniel Judson Callahan stood on the bridge of the USS San Francisco, watching the radar screen as Japanese ships approached through the darkness. It was the night of the 12th of November, and intelligence reports indicated that the enemy was bringing their most powerful battleships down from Rabaul. The Japanese force included the Hiei and Kirishima, massive vessels armed with 14-inch guns that could reduce Henderson Field to rubble if they were allowed to get within range. The American response was typically aggressive. Callahan had assembled every available ship into a task force that included 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers. A powerful force, but one that was outgunned by the Japanese battleships. His plan was to close to point-blank range under cover of darkness, using superior radar and gunnery to overcome the enemy's advantage in firepower. It was a desperate gamble, but the stakes were too high for conservative tactics. The battle began at 1:50 in the morning when the destroyer, USS Cushing, detected Japanese ships on her radar screen. The range was less than 3,000 yards, practically point-blank range for naval guns. Callahan gave the order to open fire, and the night exploded in a symphony of destruction as dozens of ships blazed away at each other in the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese battleship Hiei took multiple hits from American cruisers, her superstructure riddled with holes and her steering gear damaged. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless found himself in command of the San Francisco when Admiral Callahan was killed by a direct hit on the bridge. The cruiser's forward turrets were smashed, her bridge was a shambles, and fires were burning throughout the ship. But McCandless kept her fighting, directing damage control parties and coordinating with the other American ships by radio. According to Naval Historical Center records, his leadership during the crisis was instrumental in preventing the task force from disintegrating under the intense Japanese fire. The battle raged for less than an hour, but when it was over, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound were littered with burning and sinking ships. The Americans had lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, but they had achieved their objective. The Japanese battleships had been so badly damaged that they were forced to withdraw without bombarding Henderson Field. The Hiei would sink the following day, becoming the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. 2 nights later, the Japanese tried again. Admiral Nobutake Kondo brought the battleship Kirishima and a powerful cruiser force down from the north, determined to complete the mission that had cost his predecessors so dearly. But the Americans were ready for them. Admiral Willis Augustus Lee had positioned his Task Force 64 across the approaches to Henderson Field, using the superior radar and gunnery of his battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota to even the odds. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was a masterpiece of modern naval warfare. Lee's ships detected the Japanese force at extreme range and opened fire with their 16-inch guns while the enemy was still trying to locate them in the darkness. The Kirishima was hit repeatedly, her armor pierced by massive shells that exploded deep within her hull. The Japanese battleship capsized and sank before dawn, taking most of her crew with her to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The defeat of the Japanese battleship force marked the turning point of the Guadalcanal campaign. Without the ability to bombard Henderson Field, the enemy could not prevent American aircraft from operating during daylight hours. Japanese supply convoys were forced to make their runs at night, using high-speed destroyers that could unload quickly and escape before dawn. The Marines nicknamed these nocturnal visitors the Tokyo Express, but their cargo capacity was limited, and they could not bring in the heavy equipment needed for a major offensive. The year 1943 dawned with the sound of American artillery thundering across the jungles of Guadalcanal as Major General Alexander Patch prepared for the final offensive that would drive the Japanese from the island forever. The arrival of the Army's 25th Infantry Division had doubled the number of American troops available for operations, and fresh supplies were flowing across the beaches in quantities that would have seemed impossible just months before. The balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. General Harukichi Halokotaki commander of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, faced an impossible situation. His 17th Army had been reduced to fewer than 20,000 men, most of them suffering from malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition. Supplies were virtually non-existent, with the Tokyo Express runs providing barely enough food and ammunition to sustain a token resistance. The decision had already been made, and Tokyo Guadalcanal would be evacuated, though the word evacuation was never used in official communications. Instead, Japanese headquarters referred to it as a strategic withdrawal to preserve face. American offensive began on the 10th of January, 1943, with a massive artillery barrage that shook the ground for miles around. Colonel William Jenn's 161st Infantry Regiment advanced through the jungle in a series of coordinated attacks, their progress measured in yards rather than miles. The Japanese defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were doomed, turning every ridge and ravine into a fortress that had to be taken at bayonet point. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion conducted a remarkable patrol that covered over 100 miles of jungle terrain, hunting down scattered Japanese units and gathering intelligence on enemy positions. According to official Marine Corps historical records, Carlson's long patrol resulted in the destruction of several Japanese camps and the capture of important documents that revealed the true extent of enemy weakness on the island. His men moved like ghosts through territory that was supposed to be under Japanese control, striking without warning and disappearing back into the green maze of the jungle. The final Japanese resistance collapsed on the 7th of February, when American forces reached the beaches at Cape Esperance and found nothing but empty bunkers and abandoned equipment. Under cover of darkness, the Japanese Navy had executed one of the most successful evacuations in military history, removing over 10,000 troops from Guadalcanal in a series of high-speed destroyer runs. The operation, codenamed Key by the Japanese, had been planned with meticulous care and executed with the precision that had made the Imperial Navy famous throughout the Pacific. But the strategic victory belonged to the Americans. Henderson Field was now permanently in Allied hands, serving as a base for the bomber offensive that would eventually reduce Japanese strongholds throughout the Pacific to rubble. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered on the beaches and ridges of Guadalcanal, and the initiative in the Pacific War had passed forever to the United States and its allies. The cost had been enormous. American casualties totaled over 7,000 killed and wounded, while Japanese losses were estimated at over 25,000 men. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound held the remains of over 50 warships from both sides, a testament to the ferocity of the naval battles that had raged for 6 months. But the strategic implications of the victory were immeasurable. Australia was safe from invasion, and the road to Tokyo lay open. As the last American troops departed Guadalcanal in the spring of 1943, they left behind a transformed island. Henderson Field had grown into a major air base, complete with concrete runways and permanent hangars. The beaches that had witnessed the first Allied offensive in the Pacific were now dotted with supply dumps and hospitals. The jungle that had concealed so much death and heroism was being cleared for new construction, projects that would support the continuing war effort, the campaign that had united Marines, soldiers, and sailors in triumph had also forged a new kind of American military one that could coordinate air, land, and sea power with unprecedented effectiveness. The lessons learned in the jungles and waters of the Solomons would be applied again and again as Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, each victory bringing them closer to the final defeat of the Japanese Empire. Guadalcanal had been more than just another battle. It had been the crucible in which modern American military doctrine was forged, and the proving ground where a generation of warriors learned that no enemy, no matter how fanatical or determined, could stand against the combined might of democracy and industrial power. The island fell silent at last, but the thunder of its guns would echo through history forever.